They called it a rebellion. That was the word whispered on foreign radio waves and printed in careful headlines thousands of miles away. A rebellion, a disturbance, a local fire. But deep in the forests and shattered towns of Central Africa, the earth itself seemed to know better. Something ancient had been awakened, something that would not stay contained. Long before the first shots echoed across eastern Zaire, before borders bled and alliances twisted into betrayal, the ground had already begun to crack. This was not merely the start of a war. It was the opening tremor of Africa's coming world war. At the heart of the continent lay a country so vast it felt endless, so rich it felt cursed. Zaire, once the Congo, was a land where rivers swallowed horizons and minerals slept beneath soil soaked with memory and blood. For over 3 decades, the nation had been ruled by one man, Mobutu Sese Seko. To some, he was a strong man who kept the country together. To others, a thief dressed in leopard skin hats, who hollowed out a nation to feed his own shadow. Mobutu had mastered survival, outliving rivals, coups, and even the Cold War itself. But survival had a price. By the mid-1990s, Zaire was rotting from the inside, its institutions brittle, its army unpaid, its people exhausted. And when a structure is hollow, even a small spark can bring it down. That spark came from across the eastern border, carried not by ideology at first, but by fear. In 1994, Rwanda exploded in one of the fastest and most brutal genocides the modern world had ever seen. When the killing ended, the land was littered with corpses, and with perpetrators fleeing justice. More than 1 million people poured into eastern Zaire, among them armed militias who had orchestrated mass murder. Refugee camps quickly became military bases. Guns replaced tents. Revenge replaced relief. Zaire's eastern provinces became a ticking bomb, and no one seemed willing or able to defuse it. For the communities living there, especially the Congolese Tutsi populations, fear became a daily companion. They were accused of being foreigners, traitors, infiltrators. Old grudges hardened into law. Local authorities threatened expulsion. Villagers braced for violence. What began as political rhetoric turned into a death sentence for thousands. The world barely noticed. But across the border, leaders in Rwanda were watching closely. To them, eastern Zaire was no longer just a neighbor's problem. It was an open wound and a direct threat. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would redraw the map in blood. Rwanda, still traumatized and furious, resolved that the militias sheltering in Zaire could not be allowed to regroup. Not here. Not ever again. Quietly, Rwanda began to move. So did Uganda, whose own interests tangled with the chaos next door. The plan was simple in theory: remove the threat, stabilize the border. But history rarely obeys simple plans. When armies move in the shadows, consequences grow teeth. Yet a war of this magnitude needed a Congolese face, someone who could transform a foreign intervention into a liberation. That face emerged from obscurity, carrying decades of bitterness and unfinished revolution. His name was Laurent-Désiré Kabila. Once a Marxist guerrilla who had crossed paths with Che Guevara himself, Kabila had faded into the margins of history, running a small operation in the bush and surviving on ideology and stubbornness. To many, he was yesterday's man. To Rwanda and Uganda, he was something far more useful: a banner. In late 1996, a new force announced itself with a name heavy with promise: the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo. The AFDL, they called it. On paper, it was a Congolese movement rising against dictatorship. In reality, it was a carefully stitched alliance, backed, trained, and propelled by foreign armies with their own secrets and scores to settle. Fighters moved swiftly through eastern towns. Zaire soldiers, hungry and unpaid, often melted away without firing a shot. Entire garrisons collapsed overnight. It felt unreal, like watching a giant fall in slow motion. In the streets of Goma, panic and hope collided. Some civilians cheered the rebels, desperate for change after decades of decay. Others fled, sensing that liberation carried its own kind of terror. Refugee camps were dismantled with ruthless efficiency. Militias were hunted through forests and across borders. But in the chaos, civilians vanished too. Mass graves appeared where food lines once stood. The line between justice and revenge blurred until it disappeared entirely. Mobutu watched all of this from afar, weakened by illness and isolation. The man who once played superpowers against each other now struggled to rally allies who no longer needed him. France hesitated. The United States calculated. The Cold War was over, and Mobutu was no longer useful. As rebel columns advanced westward, the president's voice echoed through empty halls, promising resistance that never came. Zaire, the giant, was being eaten alive, one province at a time. But here is the secret the world would only realize later. This war was never just about Mobutu. It was never only about refugees or borders or revenge. Beneath the public story lay something far more dangerous, a convergence of ambitions, resources, and unresolved hatreds stretching across the continent. Each step westward pulled new actors closer. Each victory whispered temptation into neighboring capitals. The Congo was not just collapsing, it was becoming a prize. By the time Kabila's forces marched deeper into the country, the point of no return had already been crossed. What began as a targeted intervention had transformed into a rolling storm. The first domino had fallen, and Africa stood on the edge of something vast and uncontrollable. The First Congo War had begun, but its true scale, its darkest secrets, and its most shocking betrayals were still hidden in the chapters yet to unfold. And as the rebels pushed forward, one question lingered in the dust-choked air, unanswered and terrifying. Who was really in control of this war, and who would be left standing when the fire finally spread? By early 1997, the war no longer moved like a rebellion. It moved like a machine, silent in its planning, devastating in its execution. Columns of fighters advanced with uncanny coordination, appearing where no road should allow them, striking where no resistance was prepared. To ordinary Congolese citizens, it felt supernatural, as if the forest itself had turned against them. But this was no magic. It was logistics, intelligence, and foreign discipline operating behind a Congolese mask. The invisible armies had begun their march. Officially, the men advancing westward were fighters of the AFDL, led by Laurent-Désiré Kabila. Unofficially, many spoke Kinyarwanda or Luganda instead of Swahili or Lingala. They carried weapons too modern, too well maintained for a collapsing state like Zaire to possess. Their tactics were precise. Their supply lines never seemed to fail. This was not coincidence. This was preparation, months, even years, in the making. Across the border in Rwanda, military planners watched maps with cold focus. The refugee camps that once shielded genocidal militias were gone, scattered, or destroyed. But Rwanda's mission had evolved. Security was no longer enough. The deeper the rebels pushed into Zaire, the clearer a dangerous truth became. As long as Mobutu remained in power, instability would return. The cancer had to be removed entirely. And so, Rwanda stayed involved, quietly, decisively, and relentlessly. Beside them stood Yoweri Museveni, Uganda's calculating leader. Uganda's interests ran parallel but not identical. Eastern Zaire had long been a sanctuary for insurgent groups hostile to Kampala. A friendly regime in Kinshasa promised strategic depth, trade routes, and influence over one of the richest lands on earth. What Rwanda sought for survival, Uganda sought for leverage. Together, they pushed forward, each step binding them more tightly to a war they could no longer easily exit. Meanwhile, Zaire's national army, the FAZ, was collapsing in real time. Soldiers deserted en masse, stripping uniforms and melting back into villages. Others sold their weapons to survive. Generals issued orders that never reached the front. In some towns, government forces fled hours before the rebels arrived, leaving behind only frightened civilians and unanswered questions. The myth of Mobutu's power died not in a single battle, but in 1,000 quiet retreats. In the cities, the mood was dangerously divided. In Bukavu and Kisangani, crowds gathered as rebels entered, some cheering, others watching in stunned silence. For many, Mobutu's fall felt overdue, almost deserved. Decades of corruption had stolen schools, hospitals, and hope itself. If this was the price of change, perhaps it was worth paying. But liberation has a way of changing its face once the cameras leave. Nighttime arrests followed daytime celebrations. Suspected enemies disappeared. Fear earned new uniforms. As the rebels advanced, another truth emerged, one far more disturbing than battlefield victories. Civilians were dying in vast numbers, especially among the displaced Hutu populations who had fled Rwanda years earlier. Reports spoke of massacres along forest paths, of columns of refugees hunted as they tried to escape deeper into Zaire. Aid workers whispered of crimes too terrible to describe, of entire communities erased without witnesses. The war was no longer just toppling a dictator, it was devouring the vulnerable. The international community noticed, but too late, and too cautiously. The United Nations debated investigations while rebel forces crossed rivers that once marked psychological boundaries. Western governments issued statements urging restraint, even as they quietly accepted the inevitability of Mobutu's fall. There would be no intervention to save Zaire's old order. History had already turned its back. At the center of it all stood Kabila himself, a man both empowered and trapped by forces larger than his own ambition. To the Congolese people, he spoke the language of nationalism and renewal. He promised dignity, sovereignty, and an end to foreign manipulation. Yet behind closed doors, he depended entirely on foreign commanders who supplied weapons, intelligence, and strategy. Each mile gained increased his popularity, but also his debt. And debts in war are never paid in currency alone. By March 1997, the impossible seemed inevitable. The rebels reached Kisangani, a symbolic and strategic prize at the heart of the country. Its fall sent shockwaves through Africa. Zaire was no longer defensible. The road to Kinshasa lay open, stretching thousands of kilometers west like a final invitation. Mobutu's regime, once feared, now survived only on memory and denial. But here lay the deepest secret of this phase of the war, one that few understood at the time. Every victory planted the seeds of future conflict. Rwanda and Uganda were not merely helping a revolution, they were learning how easily Congo could be entered, controlled, and exploited. They were mapping weaknesses, forging local alliances, and tasting the mineral wealth beneath the soil. The Congo was no longer just a neighbor. It was a temptation. As invisible armies marched, something irreversible happened. Regional ambitions awoke. Other nations watched carefully. Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia. Each asked the same silent question. If power in Congo is being redistributed, why should we be left out? The fire was spreading, and soon, everyone would want a hand on the match. By the time the rebels paused to regroup, the war had already outgrown its name. It was no longer simply the First Congo War in spirit, only in chronology. The stage was being set for something far larger, far bloodier, and far more catastrophic than anyone was willing to admit. And as the road to Kinshasa beckoned, a chilling realization settled over Central Africa. The fall of Mobutu would not bring peace, it would open the gates to hell. The leopard had stopped roaring long before it fell. In Kinshasa, rumors moved faster than soldiers. They slipped through markets, crawled along riverbanks, and echoed in government offices stripped bare by fleeing officials. Mobutu's voice still came through state radio, defiant, theatrical, but no one believed it anymore. Power is a strange thing. It can disappear weeks before it officially ends. By April 1997, Mobutu Sese Seko was already a ghost ruling a country that had moved on without him. For decades, Mobutu had mastered the art of performance. He renamed the country, renamed the people, renamed himself. Zaire was his stage, and he was its eternal actor, anti-communist to the West, nationalist to Africa, savior to some, curse to many. But illness had reduced him. Cancer ate at his body while rebellion ate at his state. His generals no longer answered his calls. His allies no longer returned his messages. The leopard skin hat became a relic, not a symbol. As Laurent-Désiré Kabila pushed westward, negotiations began, not for peace, but for surrender dressed as diplomacy. Mobutu flew to Morocco, seeking mediation, hoping to salvage dignity if not power. There, weakened and desperate, he met Kabila aboard a ship. Two men staring at opposite ends of history. One clung to the past. The other pretended to represent the future. The meeting achieved nothing. It was already too late. When Mobutu finally fled Zaire in May, there was no dramatic last stand. No final speech to rally the nation. Just a quiet departure, like a thief escaping his own house. He would die months later in exile, far from the rivers and riches he once claimed as personal property. With his exit, a chapter of African history closed, but the book itself had barely begun. On May 17, 1997, Kabila's forces entered Kinshasa. Crowds filled the streets. Some danced. Some cried. Some simply stared, unsure whether to hope or hide. Mobutu's statues were torn down, his portrait smashed, his name cursed aloud for the first time without fear. Zaire was erased overnight. The country reclaimed its old name, Democratic Republic of the Congo. To many, this felt like rebirth. Kabila declared himself president. He promised order, dignity, and sovereignty. He banned political parties, suspended the constitution, and ruled by decree, arguing that democracy could wait, that stability came first. At first, the people accepted it. After all, Mobutu had called himself a democrat too. Kabila spoke the language of revolution, of cleansing the state of corruption and foreign control. But beneath the speeches, something darker was already forming. Because here lay the great lie at the heart of the victory: Kabila was not free. The same foreign powers that had carried him to Kinshasa now lingered in the shadows. Rwandan and Ugandan officers remained embedded in the Congolese army. Intelligence networks answered to Kigali and Kampala as much as to Kinshasa. Strategic positions, airports, supply routes, mining zones were quietly secured. The Congo had changed presidents, but it had not yet reclaimed its soul. And then there were the secrets no one wanted to confront. Investigations into wartime atrocities stalled. Witnesses disappeared. Aid workers were silenced or expelled. The fate of tens of thousands of Hutu refugees, men, women, children, was buried under the language of security operations. Kabila promised justice, but justice requires independence, and independence requires power. He had neither. Slowly, the relationship between Kabila and his former backers began to crack. The more he spoke of Congolese sovereignty, the more uncomfortable Kigali and Kampala became. They had not sacrificed blood and resources to install another unpredictable strongman. They expected obedience, access, gratitude. What they received instead was defiance wrapped in nationalism. By late 1997, Kabila made his most dangerous move yet. He ordered all foreign troops to leave Congolese territory. To the public, it was a triumphant declaration. To Rwanda and Uganda, it was betrayal. Behind the scenes, phones rang in military headquarters across the region. Meetings were called. Old alliances were questioned. New ones were imagined. If Kabila would not be controlled, he would be replaced. The same machinery that had lifted him could just as easily turn against him. The Congo, once again, became a chessboard. And that is the cruelest twist of all. The end of the First Congo War did not bring peace. It merely changed the direction of the guns. The leopard was gone, but the jungle remained. And in that jungle, far more powerful predators were beginning to circle. As the celebrations faded and the lies hardened into policy, a terrifying truth settled over Central Africa: the real war had not yet begun. History rarely announces when friendship turns into hatred. It happens quietly, through missed phone calls, ignored warnings, and decisions made behind closed doors. By mid-1998, the smiles between former allies had vanished. The handshakes were gone. In their place stood suspicion, anger, and the cold certainty that blood would soon follow. The Congo had changed leaders, but it had not escaped its curse. It had only invited new masters to argue over its future. President Laurent-Désiré Kabila believed he had reached the moment every revolutionary dreams of, the moment when the borrowed sword could finally be put down. His order for foreign troops to leave was not merely political, it was personal. Each Rwandan officer stationed in Kinshasa reminded him that his power was conditional. Each Ugandan advisor undermined his claim to sovereignty. To Kabila, independence delayed was independence denied. But to Paul Kagame and Yoweri Museveni, Kabila's declaration was not courage, it was ingratitude. They had dismantled Mobutu's regime. They had carried the war across jungles and rivers. They had paid in blood and resources. And now, the man they installed was slamming the door in their faces. Worse still, Kabila began rebuilding ties with groups hostile to Rwanda and Uganda. The very threats that had justified the First War were creeping back into the forests. What followed was not an argument. It was a decision. In August 1998, the illusion of peace shattered. A new rebellion erupted almost overnight. This time, it was faster, more coordinated, and even more shocking. Rwandan-backed forces appeared deep inside Congolese territory, not from the east, but near the capital itself. Soldiers hijacked planes. Cities fell in days. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere. Kabila barely escaped. As rebels closed in on Kinshasa, panic gripped the city. Foreign embassies evacuated. Civilians hid in churches and schools. The fall of the capital felt inevitable, until something unexpected happened. New flags appeared on Congolese soil. New accents filled military briefings. The war, once regional, was about to become continental. From the south came Angola, driven by its own fears of rebel sanctuaries along the border. From the skies arrived troops from Zimbabwe, whose leaders spoke of regional stability but eyed Congo's vast wealth. Namibia followed, honoring alliances and obligations within the southern African bloc. What began as Kabila's desperate call for help turned into a military flood. Within weeks, African armies from opposite ends of the continent were fighting on Congolese soil. The map of Africa had never looked like this before. Each nation told its own story. Rwanda spoke of self-defense. Uganda spoke of security. Angola spoke of survival. Zimbabwe spoke of solidarity. But beneath the speeches lay another truth: Congo's resources. Diamonds, gold, coltan, timber, oil. The land beneath the fighting fate was worth billions, and everyone knew it. War had become business, and business demanded territory. For ordinary Congolese people, the confusion was unbearable. One village might host 5 different armies in a single year, each demanding loyalty, food, labor, silence. Uniforms changed, but suffering did not. Children learned to identify weapons before books. Families fled not once, but again and again, chasing rumors of safety that dissolved upon arrival. Kabila, once the symbol of liberation, now ruled as a wartime president barricaded by foreign protection. His speeches grew harsher. Dissent was crushed. Journalists disappeared. The revolution had eaten its own language. And yet, without his new allies, he would not survive. Sovereignty had become a performance, necessary, loud, and increasingly hollow. This was the moment Africa crossed a line. The conflict was no longer about one man, one country, or one grievance. It was about power blocks, rival visions of regional dominance, and the dangerous belief that force could secure the future. The Congo had become the arena where Africa's unresolved tensions collided. Soldiers from nations that had never fought each other before now faced off in unfamiliar jungles, guided by maps drawn far away from the battlefield. And still, the worst was yet to come. Because when many armies fight in one land, loyalty fractures. Rebel groups multiply. Control splinters. The war no longer obeys orders, it obeys opportunity. What had started with Mobutu's fall had transformed into something unrecognizable, uncontrollable, and unstoppable. By the end of 1998, one thing was clear to anyone brave enough to say it aloud. This was no longer a Congolese war. This was Africa's war. War usually has lines, front lines, borders, uniforms that tell you who is friend and who is enemy. In the Congo, those lines dissolved like footprints in rain. By the end of 1998, the conflict had transformed into something far more terrifying than invasion or rebellion. It became a living organism, spreading through rivers, forests, and cities, adapting to every attempt to contain it. The battlefield no longer belonged to soldiers alone. It belonged to everyone. From the skies, the Congo looked unchanged, green, endless, almost peaceful. But on the ground, the land was carved into invisible zones of control. One road belonged to rebels in the morning, a foreign army by afternoon, and local militias by nightfall. Flags changed faster than loyalties. Checkpoints multiplied like weeds. To survive, civilians learned a dangerous skill: knowing what to say, what language to speak, and when to stay silent. The new war had many faces. Rwanda and Uganda backed rival rebel movements, each claiming legitimacy while quietly undermining the other. In the east, commanders once allied during the overthrow of Mobutu now eyed each other with suspicion. Former brothers-in-arms split camps, split towns, split families. The revolution had fractured, and every fracture bled. At the center of the chaos stood Rassemblement Congolais pour la Démocratie, the RCD. On paper, it was a political movement fighting dictatorship. In reality, it was a battlefield within a battlefield. Factions emerged, backed by different foreign sponsors, each claiming to represent the true future of Congo. Meetings ended in accusations. Accusations ended in gunfire. The enemy was no longer always across the line. It was often sitting beside you. As rebel groups multiplied, so did local militias known collectively as the Mai Mai. They were farmers, fishermen, spiritualists, and fighters bound together by belief rather than command. They fought not for ideology, but for land, ancestors, and survival. To them, every foreign soldier was an invader, every rebel a threat. Armed with old rifles and ritual charms, they became both defenders and destroyers, capable of heroism one day and brutality the next. Meanwhile, foreign armies dug in. Troops from Zimbabwe secured key airports and mining regions, justifying their presence as protection for a legitimate government. Angola focused on border zones, determined to prevent its own rebels from gaining sanctuary. Namibia followed alliance obligations, though its soldiers often wondered why they were dying so far from home. Each army claimed necessity. Each army left a footprint soaked in Congolese blood. The war reached a grotesque milestone when Rwandan and Ugandan forces, once allies, turned their guns on each other in the city of Kisangani. Streets became trenches. Homes became shields. Heavy artillery pounded neighborhoods where civilians had nowhere to run. It was a moment that stripped away every remaining illusion. This war was no longer about security or liberation. It was about dominance. For the people of Kisangani, survival became a gamble measured in seconds. Shells fell without warning. Bodies lay unburied because burying the dead meant risking your own life. Hospitals ran out of medicine, then electricity, then hope. And still, the fighting continued. Two foreign armies battling over a Congolese city, while the world watched in disbelief and silence. In villages far from the headlines, suffering followed a quieter rhythm. Armed groups seized food, recruited children, and punished communities accused of helping rivals. Sexual violence became a weapon, systematic, deliberate, and devastating. Women carried wounds that never healed. Children grew up knowing war as routine. Entire generations learned fear before they learned names. President Laurent-Désiré Kabila, increasingly isolated, responded with paranoia. He accused enemies everywhere, sometimes correctly, often not. He surrounded himself with loyalists and foreign guards, ruling from behind layers of suspicion. The man who once spoke of freedom now spoke the language of survival. Congo had not found peace, it had found a bunker. And yet, the deepest tragedy was not the violence alone, it was the normalization of it. As the war dragged on, death became statistics. Displacement became routine. Atrocities became complex realities. The international community labeled it a conflict too complicated to solve, a phrase that disguised inaction as wisdom. Millions were dying, not in one explosion, but in slow, grinding silence, disease, hunger, exhaustion following the path carved by war. By the turn of the millennium, the Congo had become a mirror reflecting Africa's unresolved wounds. Colonial borders, Cold War politics, ethnic tensions, economic exploitation, all collided in one vast, suffering land. The battlefield had no borders because the causes had no single source. Everyone was involved. No one was innocent. And escape was an illusion. This was the moment historians would later point to and say, here is where the war truly earned its name, Africa's World War. And still, the final twist had not yet revealed itself. Because just as the war seemed endless, fate prepared a single, silent act, one that would change everything, and yet solve nothing at all. In the chaos of the Congo, one death can change everything. And when President Laurent-Désiré Kabila fell, the world seemed to stop, and then spin faster into uncertainty. By 2001, Kabila had ruled Congo for 4 years, a period marked by endless war, fragile alliances, and constant paranoia. He was no longer the revolutionary hero who had entered Kinshasa on the shoulders of foreign armies. He was a man surrounded by distrust, constantly aware that the very powers that had lifted him to the presidency could also remove him in an instant. Rwanda and Uganda watched him closely. Southern African allies demanded influence. And within his own government, whispers of betrayal grew louder each day. It was May 16, 2001, when Kabila's life ended in a single, shocking act. Inside his presidential palace, in a corridor once thought secure, he was shot at close range by one of his own bodyguards. The assassin, whose motives remain murky even decades later, acted in an instant, leaving chaos in his wake. The palace erupted. Security forces scrambled. Officers shouted orders that could not reach every corner. And just like that, the man who had promised to secure the Congo's future was gone. To the people of Congo, the news was surreal. For some, it was liberation from a president they had begun to fear as much as they had once admired. For others, it was the ultimate betrayal. A country that had survived Mobutu's kleptocracy now faced the sudden disappearance of the man who had replaced him. Chaos spread almost faster than the news itself. Across the continent, foreign powers paused. Rwanda and Uganda, whose covert involvement had grown increasingly tense, convened emergency meetings. Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, and others mobilized troops to ensure their strategic positions remained secure. Alliances frayed instantly, and rivalries, long simmering beneath the surface, threatened to explode. One man's death had frozen the war, but it also threatened to accelerate it into a new, more unpredictable phase. Kabila's son, Joseph Kabila, was suddenly thrust into the presidency at the age of 29. He inherited a country already in flames, a military fractured by foreign influence, and a population exhausted by years of war. Yet he was young, determined, and surprisingly composed, stepping into a role that even seasoned generals feared. The transition was not smooth. There were assassination attempts, rebel uprisings, and foreign pressure all at once. But Joseph understood one critical truth: survival depended on consolidating control immediately. What few outsiders realized was how the assassination altered the entire regional calculus. Rwanda and Uganda, once allied in the overthrow of Mobutu, now found themselves on opposite sides, each seeking to influence the new president. Southern African troops strengthened their positions, wary of losing any strategic advantage. Every faction, every general, every rebel group had to reconsider loyalties. A single shot had transformed a civil conflict into a chessboard of continental proportions. Civilians, as always, bore the brunt. Rumors of revenge circulated in Kinshasa and Goma. Militias seized the opportunity to pillage towns. Refugees, already displaced multiple times, feared that the new power vacuum would trigger another wave of massacres. Humanitarian aid, scarce even before, became almost impossible to deliver. Congo had entered a freeze-frame moment in history. War paused, but suffering did not. Kabila's assassination also revealed a deeper, darker secret about the First Congo War. The power that had toppled Mobutu and lifted Laurent-Désiré Kabila had never truly left. Foreign powers, especially Rwanda and Uganda, still held the strings. Kabila's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a signal that Congo remained a battlefield not entirely of its own making. For decades, the country's wealth and geography would continue to attract armies, rebels, and mercenaries, all vying for control while ordinary citizens struggled to survive. By the end of 2001, the assassination had achieved two paradoxical outcomes. It froze the immediate war around Kinshasa while simultaneously igniting a web of new tensions that would stretch the conflict far into the future. Congo, still bleeding from the First Congo War, now faced a complex future where victory and survival were no longer guaranteed. The lesson was stark, brutal, and unforgettable. In the Congo, no one is ever truly safe. The war that had begun as a rebellion against a dictator had evolved into a continent-spanning conflict of secrets, betrayals, and ambitions, and it had just claimed one of its most pivotal figures. The Congo's wealth is buried deep, hidden beneath soil that has witnessed centuries of conquest, exploitation, and bloodshed. Gold, diamonds, coltan, cobalt, and other minerals glint like promises beneath the jungle floor. To outsiders, these were resources waiting to be extracted. To Congolese civilians, they were the invisible chains that ensured suffering continued long after the guns fell silent. And during the First Congo War and its chaotic aftermath, these mines became more than wealth. They became the fuel for a continent-spanning conflict. From the very beginning, foreign armies and rebel factions had understood this truth. When Kabila and his allies marched to Kinshasa, it wasn't just territory that mattered, it was the land's minerals. Cities and towns were important, but the hidden veins of coltan and diamonds determined which powers could sustain campaigns, arm militias, and ultimately influence the future of Congo. The invisible economy of war was as powerful as any gun or artillery piece. Rwandan-backed factions controlled eastern provinces where coltan and gold were concentrated. Ugandan allies carved up sections of the northeast, securing lucrative mining zones and river routes. Southern African troops, ostensibly defending Kabila's new regime, secured diamond-rich regions in the south and southwest. Each faction not only fought for political control but for economic dominance, knowing that whoever controlled the mines controlled the war. In towns like Bukavu, miners were conscripted by armed groups to dig for minerals under brutal conditions. Children as young as 10 worked alongside men and women, their small hands forced to sift through the soil for stones that would fund someone else's war. Families were torn apart. Villages were raided. And yet, the world's markets never paused. Minerals extracted in these conditions made their way into electronics, jewelry, and high-tech industries across the globe, an invisible thread connecting Congolese suffering to distant consumers. But the real tragedy was how these resources fueled cycles of violence. Militias bought weapons with minerals. Foreign armies financed campaigns by controlling mines. Rebel leaders who promised liberation enriched themselves at the expense of the people they claimed to protect. Every diamond, every nugget of gold, every ton of coltan became a bargaining chip in a war that had no clear end. The war and economy were inseparable. One could not survive without the other. By 1999, mining towns had become strategic objectives. Battles were fought not just for territory, but for access to shafts and pits. The rebel group RCD clashed repeatedly with Mai Mai militias and local defense forces over control of key mineral-rich areas. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Some were forcibly recruited to work in the mines, while others were executed if suspected of collaborating with the wrong faction. Survival was no longer about avoiding bullets. It was about navigating a deadly economy. Meanwhile, Kabila's government, though nominally in power, struggled to assert control over the wealth beneath its feet. Corruption, favoritism, and military weakness allowed foreign-backed forces to extract resources with near impunity. Kabila's ambition to assert Congolese sovereignty was constantly undermined by the very wealth that made the country desirable to outsiders. He ruled a country whose riches were systematically looted by friends and enemies alike. International attention waxed and waned. Humanitarian organizations highlighted the exploitation of mines, the use of child labor, and the ties between resources and armed conflict. Governments issued statements condemning conflict minerals, while often ignoring the complex reality on the ground. To withdraw from Congo was to allow war to escalate. To intervene was to risk entanglement in a continental conflict. The Congo remained a paradox, a land too rich to ignore and too dangerous to touch. And yet, amidst the horror, stories of courage emerged. Miners who refused to work under armed groups hid minerals and risked their lives to protect villages. Local leaders negotiated temporary truces to prevent massacres in mining towns. Some communities created informal networks to trade resources fairly and sustain families, a quiet resistance against the chaos consuming the country. These acts were small, fragile, and often overlooked, but they were a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable violence. By the early 2000s, the link between minerals and war had become undeniable. The First Congo War, which had begun as a rebellion against a dictator, had evolved into a multi-layered conflict driven not only by political ambition but by wealth, greed, and exploitation. The continent watched, powers maneuvered, and ordinary Congolese citizens continued to pay the price. In this environment, peace was not merely elusive, it was a commodity, just like the coltan and gold extracted from the heart of the jungle. The mines, silent and deep, had become the veins of a war that refused to die. Whoever controlled them controlled more than resources. They controlled the future of a continent. And as long as these veins remained unguarded, the blood would continue to flow. Alliances are fragile, especially when forged in war. The Congo, by now, had become a proving ground for this cruel truth. The very foreign powers that had helped topple Mobutu, elevated Kabila, and driven the initial rebellion now found themselves at odds over control, influence, and resources. What had once been a coalition built on convenience and survival began to fracture in the most dramatic, devastating way, turning the jungle into a labyrinth of betrayal. The eastern provinces, already a tinderbox, were ground zero for this unraveling. Rwanda and Uganda, once collaborators against Mobutu, began to clash openly. What seemed like minor disagreements over borders or troop deployment quickly escalated into full-scale confrontations. In towns like Kisangani, bullets flew not just between rebels and government forces, but between former allies who had once fought side by side. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, forced to choose loyalties that no longer guaranteed safety. The spark for these betrayals was both economic and strategic. Rwanda and Uganda each sought control over mineral-rich territories. Coltan, gold, and diamonds, resources that had fueled the war, were now points of contention. Rwanda accused Uganda of smuggling resources out of territories they nominally controlled. Uganda responded with counter-accusations and sudden troop maneuvers. Friendly relations dissolved almost overnight. One day, comrades in arms, the next, enemies.
Have you ever heard of a war so vast, so devastating? It's been called Africa's World War. A conflict that has claimed more lives than any since World War II, yet remains largely hidden from the world's headlines. This is the story of the Congo War, a brutal, tangled epic of ambition, betrayal, and immense suffering. But to understand this war, we have to go back to another tragedy that set the stage, the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, the world watched in horror as nearly 1 million people were slaughtered in Rwanda in just 100 days. When the genocide finally ended, the perpetrators, known as the Hutu extremists or Interahamwe, didn't just disappear. Over 1 million of them, along with innocent Hutu civilians, fled across the border into the dense jungles of eastern Zaire. which we now know as the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, they set up massive refugee camps, but these were no ordinary camps. They were military bases in disguise, controlled by the very same militias who had just carried out a genocide. From these camps, they launched raids back into Rwanda, determined to finish what they had started. Rwanda's new leader, Paul Kagame, was faced with an existential threat right on his doorstep. He couldn't let these genocidal forces regroup. He needed to dismantle those camps. But Zaire's longtime dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, was weak, corrupt, and did nothing to stop them. In fact, Mobutu's government was quietly supporting the Hutu militias. For Kagame, the only option was to take matters into his own hands, but his small Rwandan army couldn't invade a country as vast as Zaire alone. He needed an ally inside Zaire. He found one in a man, Laurent-Désiré Kabila. Kabila was an old, obscure rebel leader who had been fighting Mobutu for decades with little success. He was a follower of Che Guevara, but his rebellion had mostly fizzled out. For Kagame, Kabila was the perfect frontman. He was a native Congolese, which would give the invasion a local face, making it look like a domestic uprising rather than a foreign invasion. And so, a secret alliance was forged. Rwanda, along with its neighbor Uganda, would provide the military muscle, the strategy, and the soldiers. Kabila would be the figurehead of this new rebellion, called the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, or AFDL. In 1996, the invasion began. The combined forces of Rwanda, Uganda, and Kabila's rebels swept across Zaire with astonishing speed. This was the First Congo War. Their initial goal was to clear the refugee camps along the border. They did so with brutal efficiency, but then something changed. They saw how easily Mobutu's rotten and demoralized army collapsed. A new, more ambitious plan formed. Why just secure the border? Why not go all the way to the capital, Kinshasa, and overthrow Mobutu himself? The march to Kinshasa was relentless. City after city fell. Mobutu's 32-year reign of corruption and tyranny was crumbling. In just 7 months, Kabila's forces, backed by Rwanda, reached the gates of the capital. Mobutu, riddled with cancer and abandoned by his allies, fled the country. In May 1997, Laurent Kabila triumphantly entered Kinshasa, declared himself president, and renamed the country the Democratic Republic of Congo. To the outside world, it looked like a popular revolution. But behind the scenes, the real power lay with his Rwandan allies. They had put him in power, and they expected him to follow their script. This is where the story takes its first dark turn, into a story of betrayal. Kabila was now president, but he was a puppet on a string. Rwandan officers held key positions in his new army and government. The Congolese people, who had celebrated the fall of Mobutu, quickly grew resentful of this foreign presence. They saw the Rwandans not as liberators, but as new occupiers. Kabila felt the pressure. He was a proud nationalist, and he chafed under Rwandan control. He wanted to be his own man, the true leader of the Congo. Less than a year and a half after taking power, Kabila decided to make his move. In a stunning radio broadcast in July 1998, he thanked his foreign allies for their help, and then ordered all of them to leave the country immediately. He was firing his kingmakers for Rwanda's Paul Kagame. This was the ultimate betrayal. He had invested everything in putting Kabila in power to secure Rwanda's borders. Now, Kabila was not only kicking him out, but was also rearming the very Hutu militias that Rwanda had fought to destroy. Kabila had turned his back on his allies and embraced his former enemies. The stage was set for an even bloodier conflict. Just weeks after Kabila's decree, the Second Congo War erupted. It was a direct consequence of his betrayal. This time, it was even more complex. Rwanda and Uganda, once allies, now invaded the Congo again, but this time to overthrow their own creation, Laurent Kabila. They backed new rebel groups in the east, hoping to repeat their swift victory of 1996. But Kabila was smarter this time. He played the nationalist card, calling on all Congolese to resist the Rwandan invaders, and he found new allies of his own. Other African nations, like Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, saw the Rwandan and Ugandan invasion as a violation of Congo's sovereignty. They feared the instability it would create and saw an opportunity to gain influence and access to the Congo's immense mineral wealth. So they sent their own armies and air forces to prop up Kabila's regime. Suddenly, the Congo became a continental battlefield, with at least 9 African nations and over 24 armed groups fighting on its soil. This war was not just fought by armies. It was a war against civilians. It was a war for resources. The fighting devolved into a scramble for the DRC's vast deposits of diamonds, gold, cobalt, and especially coltan, a mineral essential for making cell phones and laptops. Foreign armies and local militias alike plundered the country's wealth, using the profits to buy more weapons and prolong the conflict. Soldiers became miners, and commanders became warlords. The betrayal wasn't just between leaders. It was a betrayal of the Congolese people, whose resources were stolen while they were subjected to unspeakable violence. The human cost was catastrophic. Millions of people died, not just from the fighting, but from the disease and starvation that followed. Entire villages were wiped out. The war created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. And in the midst of this chaos, in January 2001, another betrayal occurred. Laurent Kabila, the man who started it all, was assassinated in his own presidential palace by one of his own bodyguards. The exact motives remain murky, but it was a violent end to a turbulent reign. His son, Joseph Kabila, only 29 years old at the time, was immediately sworn in as the new president. Many thought he would be a weak and ineffective leader, but he proved to be a surprisingly shrewd operator. He called for peace talks and, with international support, managed to broker a fragile peace agreement in 2003. The foreign armies officially withdrew, and a transitional government was formed, including the former rebel groups. The Second Congo War, Africa's World War, was officially over, but was it truly over? The peace agreement ended the large-scale, state-on-state conflict, but it did not end the violence. The deep-seated betrayals and ethnic hatreds remained. The foreign armies may have left, but the countless militias they had armed and supported did not simply disappear. They morphed, splintered, and continued to terrorize eastern Congo, fighting over land and mines. The legacy of betrayal lives on. The cycle of violence, fueled by the country's resource wealth, has continued in eastern Congo to this day. The story of the Congo Wars is a grim lesson in how personal ambition and political betrayal can unleash unimaginable suffering. It began with one nation's desperate attempt to secure its borders, leading to an alliance that placed a puppet in power. When that puppet cut his strings, he triggered a continental war that devoured millions of lives and plundered a nation's future. It's a complex, heartbreaking story that the world has too often ignored. But for the people of the Congo, the consequences of these betrayals are a daily reality. Understanding this history is the first step to ensuring it is never repeated. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story important, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into world events. The late 20th century was a tumultuous time for Central Africa. In 1996, the world watched as a conflict erupted, one that would reshape the entire region. This was the First Congo War, a brutal, sprawling conflict that tore through the heart of the continent. But beneath the headlines of shifting borders and political power plays, a generation of children was caught in the crossfire. Their stories, often unheard, are a powerful testament to both unimaginable suffering and incredible resilience. Before the war, life for many children in what was then Zaire was already challenging. But they had homes, families, schools, and communities. They had the simple joys of childhood playing games, listening to stories, and dreaming of the future. The war shattered this fragile peace. It began in the east, fueled by the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, as refugee camps became militarized and old tensions flared. Soon, a coalition of forces, led by Laurent-Désiré Kabila, began a march across the vast country to overthrow the long-standing dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. For children, the world turned upside down almost overnight. The sounds of laughter in the village square were replaced by the sounds of gunfire and marching boots. Families were forced to make impossible choices. Do we stay and risk being caught in the fighting? Or do we flee into the dense, unforgiving jungle with no food, no water, and no destination? Many chose to run. Imagine being a child, holding your mother's hand, walking for days, weeks, even months. The familiar paths of your village disappear, replaced by an endless sea of trees. Hunger becomes a constant companion, a gnawing ache in your stomach. Thirst is a fire in your throat. Diseases like cholera and malaria, once treatable, become death sentences in the forest. Children witness things no one, let alone a child, should ever see. They saw their homes burned, their neighbors attacked, and their parents lost in the chaos of flight. Many became orphans in an instant, left to fend for themselves, or taken in by other equally desperate families. The social fabric that protects children completely disintegrated. Schools closed their doors, their classrooms becoming shelters for soldiers or displaced families. Hospitals, lacking supplies and staff, could offer little help. The very structure of society, the network of elders, teachers, and community leaders that guide and nurture a child, was gone. In its place was a brutal new reality governed by the law of the strong. Armed groups on all sides recruited, often forcibly, thousands of children. Boys, some as young as 7 or 8, were ripped from their families, handed a gun heavier than they could comfortably carry, and thrust into the front lines. Girls were also abducted, forced into sexual slavery, and used as cooks and porters, suffering unimaginable abuse. Yet, even in the darkest of times, glimmers of human resilience shine through. In the sprawling refugee camps that sprung up along the borders, a new kind of community was forged. Strangers became family. Women would band together to care for groups of orphan children, sharing their meager rations and offering what little comfort they could. Older children stepped up, becoming parents to their younger siblings, protecting them and searching for food and water. Small, makeshift schools would appear in the camps, run by volunteer teachers who understood that education was a lifeline, a connection to a future that seemed all but lost. They would teach under a tree or in a crowded tent, using charcoal on a piece of wood as a blackboard. These small acts of defiance, of insisting on normalcy in the midst of chaos, were incredibly powerful. It was a declaration that war could destroy homes and take lives, but it could not extinguish the human spirit's desire to learn, grow, and hope. When the war officially ended in 1997 with Kabila's victory, the fighting didn't stop for everyone. The country, now renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, was left shattered. For the children who survived, the journey was far from over. Child soldiers faced stigma and rejection from the very communities they were forced to terrorize. Orphans struggled to find a place to belong. The psychological scars, the trauma of what they had endured, ran deep. But the story of these children is not just one of victimhood. It is a story of profound strength. It's in the former child soldier who, through reintegration programs, learns a trade and rediscovers his humanity. It's in the resilience of communities that, despite their own trauma, work to heal and rebuild, to create a space where children can once again be children. Their journey reminds us that even after the most devastating storms, life finds a way to persist, and hope, however fragile, can take root once more. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider supporting organizations that work with war-affected children around the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help bring more important stories like this to light. By the early 2000s, Congo had endured not only the fall of a dictator and the rise of foreign-backed factions, but also one of the largest forced migrations in African history. Entire populations had been uprooted, massacres had erased centuries-old communities, and rivers continued to flow with reminders of what had been lost. Survival was no longer just a daily struggle, it was a defiance against the enduring violence of a continent's most complex war. The First Congo War did not end with a handshake, a treaty, or a parade. It ended quietly, in the hollow aftermath of destruction, displacement, and betrayal. By 1997 to 2001, Congo had witnessed the fall of a dictator, the rise and assassination of a new leader, and the entry of foreign armies, militias, and opportunists into every corner of its territory. Yet, the war left a far greater legacy than the immediate casualties or ruined cities. It left lessons about power, greed, and the fragile nature of sovereignty in a continent still struggling with its history. The invisible hands of foreign powers, Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, Zimbabwe, and others had shaped every major turn of the conflict, from the overthrow of Mobutu to the assassination of Laurent-Désiré Kabila and the installation of his son, Joseph Kabila. The war revealed that political borders were porous, and that wealth, particularly mineral wealth, could dictate military strategy more than any ideology. These powers had learned that influence, control, and access to resources could be achieved without claiming ownership openly, leaving Congo both liberated and imprisoned simultaneously. Civilians had endured the consequences of this manipulation in ways impossible to quantify. Millions were displaced, children became soldiers, women suffered unspeakable violence, entire communities vanished along rivers that ran red with death. The jungles and mines, which had once symbolized life and prosperity, had become instruments of war and exploitation. The human cost was staggering, and yet international attention remained fragmented, focused on diplomacy or economic concerns rather than on the human tragedy unfolding daily. Rwanda and Uganda, allies against Mobutu, became rivals in the jungle. Southern African nations intervened ostensibly to defend sovereignty, but their presence was motivated by strategic and economic interests. Local militias exploited the chaos for survival or vengeance. Every actor operated simultaneously as friend and enemy. Loyalty became transactional, and betrayal became inevitable. Despite the devastation, Congo's story was not one of hopelessness. It was a story of resilience, survival, and courage. Children navigated forests and rivers to avoid conscription. Communities hid the vulnerable. Civilians negotiated truces in ways armies could not. Even amidst the chaos, Congo's people demonstrated a determination to endure, adapt, and rebuild, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The war set the stage for the conflicts that would follow, collectively known as the Second Congo War, or Africa's Great War. Many of the dynamics established during the First Congo War, foreign involvement, exploitation of resources, militia fragmentation, and regional rivalries, became recurring patterns. In this sense, the First Congo War was not merely a conflict over a dictator or territory. It was the opening chapter of a broader continental struggle over power, wealth, and identity. Yet perhaps the most important lesson of all was the fragility of sovereignty in a world driven by invisible agendas. Congo had overthrown one man, installed another, and survived multiple invasions, but it remained a land vulnerable to exploitation. Liberation and independence proved to be fragile concepts when surrounded by powerful neighbors and hungry markets. Peace, as the Congolese discovered, is not simply the absence of war, it is the presence of justice, accountability, and control over one's own destiny. As the rivers healed and the forests slowly reclaimed abandoned villages, the war's human stories persisted. Survivors carried the memory of massacres, displacement, and betrayal into adulthood. Children who had become soldiers struggled to reintegrate. Families rebuilt homes on lands scorched by artillery. The Congo emerged from the First Congo War physically scarred, but spiritually resilient, a country forever shaped by forces both seen and unseen. In the end, the First Congo War was more than a conflict over power. It was a mirror reflecting Africa's complexities, its history of colonial exploitation, its ethnic tensions, its contested borders, and its wealth coveted by many. It was a war where every victory carried a hidden cost, every alliance concealed a potential betrayal, and every river, forest, and mine bore witness to the pain and endurance of a people. And though the war officially concluded, its echoes reverberated across the continent for decades. The First Congo War taught a harsh truth. In a land as vast, rich, and contested as Congo, freedom is never simple, peace is never guaranteed, and survival is the most courageous act of all. The First Congo War was not just a war, it was Africa's warning, its tragedy, and its story. Don't forget to subscribe for more interesting African history.